All right, welcome back. This is the Something Venture podcast. I am Kent Lindstrom. I am your host. My guest today is Brianne Kimmel. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Brianne, people listening to this podcast would think that half of venture capitalists are women. Because I've had like half, from, Maha to Ellen Powell.
You've done a great job, by the way.
I appreciate that. I'll tell you why I did that a little later. But so you're a venture capitalist, Work-Life Ventures. You don't just work there. You founded that venture capital firm. Did strategy at Zendesk, had a YC company, head of social media at Expedia, and Business Insider called you one of the VCs everyone should know.
Yeah, I was very honored about that Business Insider piece. It's really interesting when you start, getting into venture and building a track record, and then you get featured next to, individuals like Cyan or like Ellen Powell. You're like, okay, cool, wow, this is great.
And I know how hard it is to build a fund too. I know that's not the easiest thing. And so, but let's go back to the beginning. So before now, the most remote person I had. So most stories of people working in venture capital involve people who grew up in the Bay Area, they went to Stanford, or something to do with their dad, basically. The person I had who's come the farthest is Monique Woodard, who has a venture fund and came from rural Florida. But you kind of came from not the middle of Silicon Valley too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in Northeast Ohio, outside of Youngstown, Ohio, to be exact, if anyone knows Ohio well. And it's an interesting town. I mean, this is very much middle America, steel mill. Growing up, a lot of my friends' parents worked at General Motors. So very blue collar, very much, true American spirit where everyone was working hard, but most people didn't leave.
Right.
So it was an interesting thing where when I was younger, I like to joke and say I was kind of an e-girl. Like I spent a lot of time on the internet. I made a lot of friends online. Back in the day, it was started out as more playing video games and, maybe pirating some software here or there. Right. But, just kind of playing around on after school and then on evenings and weekends, and got really into tech. I actually had tested pretty well and started college when I was in high school. So I was one of these people where I was like, God,
why did you do that?
I know. I was like, God, I got to get out of Ohio. Now when I go back, I'm like, oh, this is great. It's so much fun to spend time with, great people. And Roy Bahat actually does a great job where he does this comeback cities tour. So he's taken a bunch of venture capitalists over to Youngstown, Ohio to spend some time there. I'm like, that's great. That's where I grew up. It's great restaurants, great people. But yeah, it was definitely an unconventional journey and very much self-led and self-taught.
I never understand why people are in such a rush to get out of high school and college. And in fact, I was thinking about this the other day. When you hear about people who graduate from college when they were 17 or something like that? Does that I went to Northwestern. There were no 14-year-olds running around, and nor should there have been.
Yeah,
that's really weird. Does Harvard have a bunch of 12-year-olds there? It seems crazy to me.
It's really interesting. I think that I've recently heard now in the era of Lambda School, and now that we're rethinking, education from the ground up. It's been interesting to hear a lot of these programs are actually a way for states to retain really smart people. Yeah. So they'll say, why don't you start college a little bit early? We'll pay your tuition. We'll give you the textbooks. It's very turnkey. Yeah. And I've been asked that a lot, I think, especially when I first started fundraising. It was interesting to hear, having spent time with the other venture capitalists who grew up in the Bay Area, who went to Stanford, who have parents that have been in venture. For them, at what point did you think about coming to Stanford? Right. And I was like, to be honest, I grew up in Northeast Ohio. My parents went to college. Yeah. I will say, they highly encouraged me to go to college, but I think at the end of the day, the view was like a degree is a degree. Yeah. So for me, it was, how do I actually get in, get out as quickly as possible? And I wasn't really optimizing for network. So I think in hindsight, I absolutely love the Stanford network. I spent a lot of time with Berkeley, Stanford, MIT, CMU. I actually go back to Pittsburgh quite a bit and spend a lot of time at CMU. And I think that the network is something that definitely compounds over time. So I sort of lack in that. What I lack in that, I have to make up for in just externally networking and hosting events and building that one.
So, know, according to Business Insider.
So I think that there is a benefit in having that Ivy League network. I think for those of us that don't have that, we will typically find ways to overcompensate, and oftentimes it's by starting other things or kind of making our name be known in other ways.
What were your folks doing there in Ohio that you were...
Great question. When I was growing up, my mom was actually a social worker. Yeah. So she had studied English, was a social worker. I remember when I was younger, God, it was so funny. We would have just kids and different people in our house all the time. Like it was like open door policy. Hey, do you want to come over for dinner? Like very much a warm and welcoming family.
That's pretty cool.
My dad, he has always been more in logistics. So for him, his company is actually a distributor, a wholesale distributor for food. So he's very much in like the CPG part of the world.
Oh, wow.
So it's super fun for him. Like, you know, he's the first person to ask me about how Hint Water's doing and all these new snacks. And he's like very interested in like, hey, who's carrying what on like the Facebook campus and like what are Google snacks like? He's like the CPG guy, which is actually, it makes it super fun.
That was not what I expected.
He also thinks I'm a Salesforce admin. And whenever I go home, he has questions around like, oh, hey, there's like this question with Salesforce. Do you know how to like configure it? I'm like, I could probably try.
I could probably find a YouTube video that
I
explains
could probably try,
things.
but integrating Salesforce is not my sweet spot.
So you went to school in Ohio too, right?
I did.
Went to Kent State?
Yeah, I went to Kent State. When I was growing up, it was funny. I spent a lot of time in Pittsburgh and did a lot of the like CMU summer camps and had spent a lot of time with a number of different universities. I think the nice thing about being in that part of Ohio, Pennsylvania, you have access to great schools. So you have great schools up in Cleveland. You have Youngstown State, which was basically an open door policy for kids in high school if you wanted to go and take classes. You have CMU in Pittsburgh and Pitt, which is also great, and UPMC. And then for me, I actually went to Kent State, so I studied journalism.
Do you get the Kent State thing?
I do, yeah.
My name's Kent, and I get it.
Yeah,
they're like, you know about the thing, right? I'm like, I do know about the thing.
I do, and I think it's really interesting because now, especially being in the Bay Area and especially being in regions that are pretty politically active, I would say that is something that it really drives the discussion, where I think in a lot of ways, Kent State has really continued to foster that sort of spirit of both being politically active, of speaking about issues that matter. I was very fortunate. I feel like for growing up in Northeast Ohio, it's probably similar to the way that people in Austin feel, where it's very much like Ohio's pretty conservative, but like Kent State is very blue.
Yeah.
So I think it was a great kind of testing ground for being on the Kent State radio show or spending a lot of time in music and culture. And I remember I took a lot of like African American studies classes, and there's just a lot of classes that I took very early on because I was so young that I ended up leaving with both journalism, CS, and then a lot of random interest courses.
That is super cool. I heard a podcast recently, shockingly a podcast. It was a stuff you should know about the Kent State shoot, and it was this crazy story that I'd never heard before about how it could have been way, way worse the way the whole situation was setting up. And there's one guy, it was a professor or something that made it not be way worse.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's been interesting going back to I recently went to I was back in Cleveland visiting my brother, and we went to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And you're you have this amazing IMPA building in Cleveland. You have multiple stories of all of this amazing history, and there's this whole section. I remember it because there's this whole section on San Francisco, and the beauty of the city and the art and the culture and the music. From Haight-Ashbury and from this whole sort of generation of festivals and of ideas, and it was really cool just to see bringing that all together. And I think especially seeing how each city is evolving and changing so quickly, it's nice to kind of take a step back and appreciate what it used to be and sort of where it's going.
Yeah. What was the plan with journalism?
With journalism, it was an interesting one. I actually I wanted to do online. So I think in a lot of ways, online journalism then led me to computer science, where at that point in time, new platforms are just taking off. A lot of people had their own blog or there were RSS feeds, but there wasn't really as much online journalism as there is today. So it's been really interesting to see. That's definitely still something that I track very closely. I also love this new generation of journalists turned venture capitalists. Yeah. So
the most famous one, right, is Mike Moritz, right?
Yeah, exactly. Mike Moritz. Now we have Alexia at Dream Machine, Catherine Kelly at General Catalyst. All of the folks that initialized, I feel are doing a really great job from a marketing and comm standpoint. And obviously, Kim May Cutler is very prolific when thinking about real estate and sort of the future of cities. So I feel it's an interesting way of approaching venture capital, because I do feel there is this shift towards idea generation, really thinking through and publishing your ideas. And I am seeing, like, whether it's a podcast or a Substack or any of these new mediums, it does feel like VCs are doing a pretty good job on the content front.
Yeah, that's interesting. What do you make of like how journalism is different from when you left school and you were thinking about probably not how it would apply to your venture capital career, but how it would apply to being a journalist? What do you think has sort of changed over time?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's an interesting time right now where, in a lot of ways, and this is across all sectors, that people are shifting more internally, and everything more is about the individual writer. Where I think historically, and I actually would say that the same goes for a lot of the new solo GP funds, where I think historically, the goal is to join a real institution, and it's been an enduring institution, whether it's a Fortune 500 or a major publication or the Sequoias and Andreessens of the world. Like, no matter what industry, I think historically individuals have always gravitated towards the ability to go to the institutions and to the brands. Whereas I feel like recently it's been so interesting to see just how much pressure there is on the individual to have your own Substack, to have to grow your own mailing list, to have your own podcast. I think in a lot of ways, some people do it more organically and more authentically. I think for others, like this whole vision of you as you basically, it's like me as a service. Like, can you actually be the next Joe Rogan, and what would it take to get there?
Yeah.
And I feel like it's exciting because you can be creative. I also hear from people, it's also a lot of pressure if it's not very intuitive.
Yeah. I find people way overestimate how interesting they are. like for doing a podcast, like, I'm going to do a podcast. It's going to be about like, I don't know, some obscure like Series A funding. You're like, yeah.
Yeah, it's so true. And I feel like sometimes, I think there's pros and cons to every model. I feel like, if you look at a newsletter like Fred Wilson's newsletter, it's just enough information where he's consistently top of mind. It's like everyone knows Fred Wilson. Oh yeah, it might be sort of a random interaction or something he's thinking about, but at least he's top of mind. Yeah. And then I think on the opposite end of the spectrum, I know that like Sarah Tavel is a great example where I think Sarah writes a couple of times a year, but when she writes, it's something that's very actionable, and it's something that the whole ecosystem sort of comes together, and they're like, oh yeah, that's a good piece.
Yeah, I think like James Currier at NFX does a pretty good job of like, but to give you an idea of writing about network effects businesses, but they've got like a team of people doing it. Like these things are not like, you see these things. You hear some podcasts too, like How I Built This. There's like 12 people working on that. Like that's what that is. So when people are like, oh, I want to do a podcast and what do I need to buy? I'm like, it's a thing. Like, if you haven't done radio before, you did radio at your school, I did radio at Northwestern. So that's like, I kind of get a sense of how it works, but.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think that people always underestimate the amount of hours it takes to do something. And I do feel like we're reaching this point. I actually, I had tweeted about it the other week because I was thinking about it. I'm like, now that everyone has podcasts and newsletters and everyone's on this VC race for distribution and for followers, I think it's actually a great time to not do it. Yeah. Like, you have to, zig when others are zagging.
Well, take advantage of it.
Yeah.
Like, people come to me all the time like, hey, can I be on your podcast? So they show up for like an hour. Like, that's all they have to do. And now they've reached, tens of thousands of people.
Yeah, it's
like
so
you were
true.
going to do a conference that had tens of, most days you don't do a conference like that. So it's a great time to go take advantage of all the people who want you on their podcast.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and I think it's a very different medium where I find whether it's podcasting, whether it's writing a newsletter, I think getting into the habit of sharing your ideas is really important. And that's something that I communicate that or like share that a lot, especially with people who are early career. I think early career, it's all about optimizing for experience, optimizing for that next move. But I think you reach a point in time where I think, especially for how competitive it is to hire, especially in Silicon Valley, or especially if you have an early stage startup, people end up choosing and joining your company based on you. So I do encourage founders to spend some time thinking about like, what's the story behind the company? What makes you unique, and how are you really thinking about culture from the very earliest moments of your company? Because that's why people are going to get on board.
Right. So we're not Silicon Valley yet. You leave college. What do you head overseas? Is that what you?
Yeah. So I actually went overseas. I had spent a summer in Sydney, Australia when I was an undergrad. From there, I made a bunch of connections, made a lot of friends. Was very fortunate to actually spent about a year and a half at more of an advertising agency where I had worked with Nikon doing early influencer marketing.
Wow.
A lot of the influencers that I had worked with at the time had 10, 15, 25,000 followers. They now have 1.5 to 2.5. Right. So there's whole generation of me as a service, which is really quite interesting.
And is that like models, or is it like, what is that like?
Primarily at the time they were bloggers. So I have a really good friend, Margaret Zhang. She was in law school. She started creating content, started out as more sort of fashion and editorial. Today, she's producing her own films. She works with the Chanels of the world and is just a full-blown, full-time creative. But she was studying and getting her law degree, and over time just, continued to advance her creative medium and test different formats. So started out primarily as a text-based blog, then moved into very, very early content on Instagram, and then now she's doing full-blown film. Wow. So it's interesting to see the evolution of people who make it as an influencer and people who can transition from more traditional classes of work into this new modern like full-time creative work.
Yeah. So how do you start bending towards Silicon Valley? You got to get out of Australia somehow, get back here.
Yeah, thankfully for my parents, I probably could have stayed in Sydney forever. It's a beautiful city. It's a great place to live. I loved it dearly. I had started a company while I was there. I had also been teaching classes on evenings and weekends at General Assembly. So I was pretty plugged into the APAC startup scene. And then from there, Silicon Valley made the most sense. Like I had always been doing more, tech-related things. I was teaching a go-to-market boot camp at General Assembly. With Expedia, I will say it's very much a fluid work environment. So they highly encourage you to work across all of the different Expedia properties. Yeah. So it's very similar to being at a Microsoft or an Amazon, where I had started on Orbitz. I had worked on Hotwire for a little bit. I worked on Expedia Inc. And then just over time, just kept picking projects based on what would be interesting, like what gave me the most exposure internally and what were exciting problems to solve. So I moved to San Francisco, had actually worked on the HomeAway acquisition. Oh, yeah. So got to work on the HomeAway acquisition, which was great to learn more about both Airbnb and what was happening in sort of the new economy of opening up your home to strangers. So I thought that was a really great project to work on. Shortly after that, after the HomeAway acquisition closed, I ended up leaving Expedia after about 4.5 years. So I loved the time there and thought it was a great introduction to tech. But after being in San Francisco for a year, you're like, I just kind of want to do the startup thing. Yep. I think it's very hard for larger companies to retain young talent in an area like San Francisco because all the buzz is in startups.
Yeah. And so did you start investing somewhere along the way too? You've invested before.
I did. Yeah. It was so interesting. I mean, I was when I was at Expedia, you end up running, a large percentage of your day is running RFPs. Right. So really figuring out what is the core tech stack, what are the things that we can build internally versus what are the core technologies that we need to lean on other companies for. And in doing that, had built the social customer support team. So I was owning essentially everything from performance marketing, which ended up looking like a lot of programmatic stuff on Facebook, Google AdWords, SEO, then ended up rebuilding a dedicated social customer care team. And part of that was actually running an RFP looking at things like Zendesk, Salesforce, all of the new technology that had a more social nature. And in doing that, just started spending a lot of time in the SaaS world. So both running RFPs, I had hosted a few times a month. We'd do almost like a travel tech meetup at our office. So got to meet a lot of early stage startups that way. So I kind of had this very startup DNA for a long time. It wasn't until I was at Zendesk and really started thinking about, like, if I loved, thinking about internal tools and I love this software part of the business, now I'm at Zendesk, which is very much part of this more consumerization of enterprise where logo matters and brand matters. And, our annual customer events have individuals like Mindy Kaling giving the opening speech. I'm like, oh, there's something really interesting happening in the workplace where, both the software is getting easier to use. People are paying for it and putting it on a credit card, which is what we saw a lot at Zendesk. I also saw that there was, in leading the apps marketplace, there was just a lot of new interesting companies that were being built on top of Zendesk or fully integrating. And in doing that, I started noticing different companies that I just thought were really cool. And I think at the end of the day, as an angel, you have the benefit of using your own money to invest in things that you think are cool.
Right.
So that was part of the beauty of it, where I had been an angel investor in Webflow purely because I like the product.
Good work.
I mean, it was an interesting one where Zendesk, Airbnb, there's a number of companies that are very opinionated when it comes to design. And I think that what ends up happening at these companies is that each individual person is very particular about the tools that they're using.
Right.
So the one thing that I noticed is with a product like Webflow, everyone from our chief design officer down to our individual brand designers, they loved it. They were like, this is so cool, this is interesting. It like checks our box from a design standpoint, which internally we all knew like, wow, that's a really big deal. And the same goes for now that I spend time with the Airbnb alumni folks who are spinning out to start stuff. It's like their ability to take these internal tools that they build and productize them. That actually is quite possible because they've been so opinionated on the tools that they're using, and oftentimes at Airbnb, like the other tools aren't good enough, let's just build it ourselves. And I think that mentality has actually led to some really interesting and great companies, and I was fortunate to just kind of start tracking and seeing like which one of these are great team, large market size, and just kind of cool at the end of the day was sort of my filter as an angel, which obviously changes once you have your own fund, but it was a good starting point.
Yeah. So at what point do you decide, so contrary to what I said at the beginning of this podcast, most venture capitalists are not actually women. At what point do you decide, like, I could start, not be a venture capitalist, I could start a venture capital firm, I'm a woman, and I'm going to do it by myself?
Yeah, it's a great question.
At what point is that? At what point?
Yeah, so I think it's one of these things where when I was at Zendesk, I was spending a lot of time in the ecosystem. I was hosting a lot of dinners. I was, I run this program. I was doing it twice a year. I now do it once a quarter called SaaS School. So I took all of the great individuals and mentors and advisors and folks that had been helpful to me throughout my career and said, let's all get together. We had been doing more informal dinners, and this was more like the head of growth at Drift, head of growth from Dropbox, head of product from Slack. There was like a whole collective of us that would get together for dinner and compare notes on growth experiments and things we were working on, and kind of got together as almost a mind group. And I thought about it. I'm like, wow, this is really interesting. I think we can tweak the model a little bit and make it relevant for very early stage. So the whole vision was to basically, super simple landing page, use a type form, tweet it out on social media. Let's see if we can get some seed and Series A companies who want to come learn from us and also just get together. Mm-hmm. And I felt like it was a really interesting point where I was doing these things on evenings and weekends. And then as I started spending time with other VCs, I'm like, oh, wait, you actually get paid to do this full time. This is what you do.
Yeah, it took me a while to figure that out too.
Yeah, it was so funny. I'm like, oh, cool. I'm like coming to all these free dinners. What's the deal with this? They're like, oh, this is actually part of the job. Like networking, building community, portfolio support. I'm like, oh, I actually really, I want to figure out a way to do this full time. And while I was at Zendesk, the question was, with my operator hat on, do I spin out and start something? Like now that I've had a lot of exposure and I've especially seen things that are growing and scaling on the apps marketplace, like I have a pretty good sense of like what are some problems to solve and I could turn this into a SaaS company. I think the second thing was, do I join the next most interesting hot SaaS company? And I always tease Dylan Field at Figma about this because basically my whole core team from Zendesk is now at Figma. Wow. So I'm like, this VC thing better work out because the folks at Figma are having a lot of fun right now. Yeah. And then, the other option was, do I do venture full time? And I think there was two options there. It's like you join an existing platform or you start something. And it's been a really interesting journey because for a lot of my closest friends and for a lot of the individuals that I co-invest with the most, a lot of them opted for the new fund route. And I think it's been really interesting to see, platforms are great in terms of, you have a great partnership, you have a great ability to see everything, or it's like the coverage when you're at a Sequoia and an Andreessen, any of these firms, you just see everything, which is awesome. I think what's different and where I'm super excited is I feel like there is this next generation of very founder-friendly operator angels who are going to raise outside money. And I felt like for me, going into a traditional platform would be a lot of fun, and I think that it would be a great learning exercise. I also felt like starting your own fund and building an institution and having a lot more influence and authority over deal by deal decisions was actually the better path for me. So I felt like because I had developed so much expertise and continued to really stay focused on enterprise SaaS, future of work, and having a very dedicated fund, I'm like, I think it would be a really interesting model where every company that I invest in can learn from each other.
Right.
So it's like a very focused model to which like every new addition is not just a win for myself. It's actually a win for the community because it's another person that comes to our dinners. It's another person that contributes at SaaS School. It's just a tighter way to really build the ecosystem. And I felt like for right now, there's a lot of work to be done in workplace software. I think that if you talk to investors, they'll say like, is the market cooling off? Have we hit peak SaaS? And I think that to me, that typically signals they haven't spent enough time inside of a company. Yeah. So the minute, if you were to job shadow each individual person inside of a company, they're going to show you exactly the tools that they use. They're going to tell you why they hate them. Like it's very clear there's so much work to be done. And, for every, Zendesk or Mixpanel or Dropbox, I'm thinking of all of these companies that have now been around, 5 to 10 years. A lot of them are now seeing new, smaller competitors that are turning out to be pretty large businesses. Yeah. So I remember the first time I met Jason Kalkanis, he had said to me, he's like, I looked at Zendesk and I passed on it. He's like, I looked at it, I was like, it's okay, but I definitely passed on it. And then now you look at just how large, Zendesk is. Then you have Freshdesk, which is like a direct head-to-head competitor. And then you have this next generation of Front, which is a venture-backed company, Customer with a K, which is basically Zendesk for customer support. They're based in New York. And you have this thriving ecosystem of new tools for customer support, and that's just one team.
Yeah.
So I feel like if you wanted to unbundle the entire workplace, there's plenty of billion-dollar companies to go around.
Yeah, as Mark Andreessen, your investor says, like it's just beginning. Like software is eating the world, and like software continues to eat the world. The world's just now getting connected. Like you've been connected for a while, but the rest of the world hasn't until just recently at like 5G speed. So it's like, every time it gets declared over, it's like kind of just beginning. For sure.
Yeah. I think that the most interesting thing as well is like, I would say for my area of focus, and especially for a first-time fund, my portfolio is heavily concentrated in the Bay Area, which I think is great because you have a lot of institutional knowledge and you have a lot of great people who've done it before. The hard part is there's just so much opportunity elsewhere, whether it's India or whether it's China. Like I look to some of the other platforms, like I know Lightspeed and Sequoia have spent so much time investing in India. And then you see things like Freshworks, or you see, one of the companies that's kind of like the one that I missed is my friend Abhi's company called Postman. Mm-hmm. And Postman came out of India. The minute they land in San Francisco, they have multiple term sheets and, are off to the races, hiring really great people and individuals that I've respected, throughout my career. So great companies come from anywhere. Yeah. And I feel like, the next 10 years, we're going to see a lot more coming from India.
Yeah, I think that'll come for you, for all of us, from if you have a brand around your venture firm. So we kind of joke about there's people like I do fintech. And so when to call the guy who goes, I do fintech.
Yeah.
Of course, anyone can do fintech, but you know when to call. And then the people who say, like, well, we invest in world-class entrepreneurs. Like, that's great, but I don't know when to call you. Like, and no one invests in, like, loser entrepreneurs, so it doesn't really help you. But when you say, look, it's the future of work, is that how you say it?
Yeah.
Then, as that brand goes around the world, people in India can say, I need to get to her eventually. So you don't have to go to India and talk to everybody and figure everything out now or someday soon. They'll just go, I've got a future of work product. Can I talk to you?
Yeah.
And your brand will carry you around the world.
So true. Yeah, it's so true. And I also find, I think especially with Having come from a software company that grew more bottom up, what's interesting now is it does look like every firm is hiring their sort of bottom up SaaS person. So Mercy Grace had joined Lightspeed. She was previously head of growth at Slack. Quentin Clark recently joined General Catalyst, and he was the CTO at Dropbox. Todd Jackson just joined First Round, and he was previously head of product at Dropbox as well. So you start seeing like, oh, this is becoming a thing because the area of expertise is so specific that each firm is hiring a dedicated person, which I think is pretty promising. That was not the case, I would say, even 12 months ago, where now I feel like it's great to see there's a lot more clarity for entrepreneurs. When I was actually first getting started as an angel investor and starting to go to some VC dinners or starting to spend some time with early stage founders, it was interesting to hear just how different a consumer team and an enterprise team is within a firm. And that was one where I was incredibly surprised because, you will hear about partner dynamics and how do people think and how do they get along and like how are things structured internally at a VC firm. But it was also interesting to hear that there was this very thin gap where it was basically traditionally the consumer GPs and especially in recent years are getting interested in more macro shifts that impact consumers. So that tends to be consumer social. In recent years, it's been gaming and esports. Mm-hmm. And there was this gap where it's kind of like, well, I kind of want to talk to that consumer person because they understand bottom-up adoption. They understand like real, true user acquisition. But I'm kind of getting put in this like old school enterprise bucket where I don't really understand, sales quotas. I don't really understand any of these things yet because I'm an engineer, my co-founder's an engineer, and we've built a landing page and we're starting pretty small with a bottom-up product.
Right. So why you decide to start a venture capital firm, which is starting anything is crazy. Why didn't you go find yourself a partner to kind of pull through? Why did you go do this on your...
Yeah, it's a great question. So I will say that right now in the ecosystem, it's been really interesting to see the total number of solo GP funds. And I think oftentimes these are funds where people have a certain level of either differentiated access and exposure, like they have a growing personal brand. Some individuals are currently CEOs, like Rahul Vara from Superhuman. He just raised some outside money. So you start having these people where it's sort of like founders know what they're getting when they come to you, and it's like a very specific value prop. It's a very specific network, and I think it keeps it pretty clear in terms of ways to deliver value quickly. The one thing that I, had spent a lot of time, and I'm fortunate to have great mentors, like, in comparing notes with Mark Andreessen and spending some time with Mike Maples, and talking to even some later stage firms like Rob Ward at Meritech. It's one of these things where it's like the ecosystem, like this style of investing is so new, where I think historically the super angels did go on to raise larger funds. So you had like Iden at Felicis, you had, obviously Mark Andreessen and Ben Horowitz ended up teaming up and having their angel fund together. I think what's different now is I think that founders' expectations are changing, and I think that as there's no shortage of new seed funds, I think that founders will continue to gravitate towards an individual partner. So I think one of the questions that a lot of the solo GP funds have is in a lot of ways, we're still kind of operating as if we're founders or if we're operators. So I'm noticing that there's a threshold where it's like a lot of the folks that are sort of my class of operator angels, we're all raising between like 5 to 10 million. And the goal is to basically be as helpful and collaborative as possible without really getting tagged as a VC, which is kind of a funny model. And I think, that may actually change as we start to scale into larger fund sizes, or if a few of us, decide to team up and we create a more modern firm. I think that will change. I think the minute that you're tagged a VC, you kind of have a walking target on your head, especially on Twitter, where for a lot of us, like being helpful, doing working sessions, like doing a lot of these things without having the VC label has actually helped us get into some really good companies.
It's interesting. It's interesting is we've talked to a bunch of LPs raising our fund. There's this weird thing going on where there's a lot of new VCs and like not a lot of ones that the LPs want to invest in.
Yeah.
So there's like a lot of stuff. Like it's
so interesting.
It's some guy who like worked at Airbnb, and like you look at him and you go, yeah, you're great, but in 2 years you're going to go back and start a company. Or there's like, God bless them, but an entrepreneur doing it on the side, like it's not like running a company is that easy that you've got free time to be a venture capitalist on the side. Like celebrities, okay, that's cute, but like in terms of like a real serious person, like you're obviously serious, you're doing this full time, you've got a thesis, you've got a track record. There actually aren't a ton of those out in the market.
Yeah, it's a really interesting case in point. I think in a lot of ways, we'll see how this plays out. I feel like with the $1 to $5 million funds where people are operating on the side, typically the strategy is that they have a strong alignment with other general partners that are doing it full time, or they just have a really great network where they're helping put people into business. I think that's a very different model than maybe doing the 10 to 25 million, where you need to raise outside money. You start raising from institutional investors. And I think the greatest question is like being a good steward of other people's money is different than investing in people that you know or things that you think are cool. Yep. So I think like going pretty deep on portfolio construction is really valuable, and spending more time on actually guiding entrepreneurs from a valuation standpoint, because I think that is something where I do spend a lot of time, where right now the money is freely flowing. I do actually, spend a lot of time with entrepreneurs weighing the pros and cons of, do you raise a modest round now, or do you raise something much larger to give yourself more runway? And I think that the ecosystem currently supports both. It's typically up to the founder how much they actually want to raise and who they want to partner with. I do find if you want to raise a seed round from one of the top tier multi-stage, one of the big platforms, they'll always encourage you to raise more. And oftentimes the valuations are very attractive. So that works for repeat entrepreneurs or individuals that know how they're going to spend the money. It's less appealing for first-time founders, where they feel this immediate pressure, and the timeline for finding product market fit changes as well.
Right.
So I think there are a lot of options in the ecosystem. I'm confident, like I love spending time with the solo GPs. I think that initially coming into it, or institutional LPs have asked me, they're like, are these individuals unhireable, or are they prickly? Like why are they doing their own thing? And it's so funny because I would say a few nights a week, last night included, we all get together for dinner. We all, catch up and, have a real sense for what everyone wants to do long term, which I think is really important. So, these are a collective of people that aren't going anywhere. They want to build a great reputation in Silicon Valley. They are very founder friendly, and, it makes them some of the most delightful people to work with.
Yeah.
So we'll see over time, how that changes. I think that, relationships and dynamics can change a lot year over year, especially in a place like Silicon Valley. But for now, it's been a lot of fun just catching up and seeing how everyone's strategy is quite different. And in a lot of ways, because we're not leading rounds, we end up just collaborating in a lot of ways where, I'm good at a very specific set of things. And, the person sitting next to me at dinner is, great at something that's completely complementary and very different.
It's interesting. Unlike most of the VCs I've talked to, you talk very, very much in the language of with other VCs, being collaborative, a community. You've used like four or five different words for that. That's a little bit unusual. Like, I just hear that as you're talking.
Yeah, it is. I think it's an unusual model. I will say that. I think this comes down to not being the lead investor. And I have a theory on this, because I do find in a lot of ways, when you talk to founders, they will tell you what matters. And I think in a lot of ways, a lot of the traditional systems and processes of Silicon Valley no longer really suit entrepreneurs. And I oftentimes use the board seat as a real like tangible thing to talk about, where if you talk to someone who's 10, 15 years in your tech career and you're sitting across from them at dinner, the first thing they're going to tell you is the board that they're on, whether it's an independent board seat or, for a VC, it's how many board seats can you put on your LinkedIn, and are they under one item under your firm, or are they independent, individual flags, and it takes up the whole feed.
So annoying when people do that. It drives me crazy.
And I see the pros and cons to both. I think what's interesting is when you talk to a founder, they'll tell you who's helpful, and they'll tell you, it's the work that happens outside of the board meeting that actually matters. It's the person that you call when things get hard. It's the individuals that you feel like you can be truly honest with. And sometimes that's your board member, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes that dynamic sort of changes over time. But I think it's really interesting to see that like we have all of these constructs that we view in having varying degrees of importance. But when you talk to entrepreneurs, like at the end of the day, we need as many people to help these companies be successful as possible.
Yep.
And I think like I take a pretty low ego stance when it comes to building enterprise companies, simply because the more sector line CEOs or partners or, great operators we can get on the cap table early on, the better. And the reason for that is it just takes a lot of cooks in the kitchen to make an enterprise company work. So whether that's having sector line CEOs that can help drive some of the integrations that need to be built, or whether that's having a mentor who's like 1 or 2 funding rounds ahead of you. Like I think the new model is to be as low ego as possible when it comes to pre-seed and seed, with the goal of accelerating time to product market fit and getting the right people on the cap table.
So how do you feel about it now? You're a venture capitalist. You went from I'm going to be a venture capitalist to raising a fund and being a venture capitalist, which very few people in the world really are.
Sure.
How do you feel about it now? Like, good idea?
Yeah, the TLDR is, I think that it is one of these roles where, coming from Northeast Ohio, I had never heard of venture capital. I had family in finance. Like I have friends and family on Wall Street. It's very different.
Yeah.
I think venture is one of these rare, let's call it an asset class. It's a rare asset class where it's like ideas and the people can actually change the trajectory of the outcome, and like in a really real way, where I feel very honored to, be in these positions where the decisions that we're making today can absolutely make or break a company. Like I always like to say startups are on a race against time. And I think that every decision really matters, because at the end of the day, early stage companies are experiments. They require very fast, smart decision making. They also are very well aware that you're going to make mistakes along the way. And those mistakes you have to course correct really quickly, because you're going to run out of money.
Yeah.
So I think it's been a really interesting, intellectually challenging exercise to raise my own firm. I think it's also given me a lot of empathy for entrepreneurs too.
Yeah.
Where it's like, in one call, I'm having, a great discussion with a seed stage entrepreneur, and we're talking about product. And the next call, I have an LP that's, evaluating early stage venture against different asset classes, which in their world means real estate, private equity, or building a hospital in their own name. Yeah. And you're like, at the end of the day, like
Timber's always in there for some reason.
Yeah. It's so funny. Like I can sell the vision, but at the end of the day, like LPs have to lean in. And if it's between investing in an early stage VC fund or leaving a lasting legacy and putting your name on a building, like that's a real risk reward payoff, and something that, I think when founders hear that, they're like, oh wow, these are really fascinating people. And having that like contrast between early stage company building, where it's just like, I just need to get my safety mask on and make sure that we can survive and like have free lunch for our employees and not fire people, compared to like on the other side, you have these LPs where it's like they want to build a lasting legacy and they're thinking about like naming buildings after themselves.
Yeah. Well, I'll finish up. I'll ask you, when I started this podcast, like not this episode, but doing this whole thing, a lot of what I did is I would be listening to these podcasts where people just talking about A is the new B. And I'd be talking to like a female friend of mine, and she'd be like, oh, this is what happened to me yesterday. This guy, my 3:00 meetings always get moved to drinks and whatever. I'm like, come on, that doesn't really happen in Silicon Valley in 2018 or 2019. And they'd be like, I'm coming on your podcast to explain this. Like, that's what it was. It was me like going, okay, I'm a fool. I'm wrong. Come on the podcast and talk about it. I had Julian Guthrie on, who wrote Alpha Girls.
Great.
Which was the early, and by the way, they're making it into a miniseries.
They are. Yeah. And I think I've spent some time with MJ Elmore and some of the women that are featured, and they're amazing people.
Well, and they had read the book, but it was very different back then. They kind of they were harassed like people are today. And they were, as opposed to like a Me Too kind of thing, they're more like roll with it. It's just a different time. Like, it was very, very interesting. But what do you make of the, like, the state of affairs now? We had a Me Too thing a year ago. It's a little quieter publicly, but,
Yeah, it's look, I think that a lot of these issues are systematic issues, which means that they will take years to unpack and to truly, understand and find rational ways of solving these problems. And I think it's been really interesting, especially as a female general partner, you get to hear a lot. And it's because, like, being someone who's different, being a trusted face in the ecosystem, I think part of the goal with, having my own fund and with partnering with other solo female GPs and just spending time in the ecosystem is, a lot of it is just letting truth be known. I think in a lot of ways, even this is kind of speaking more from a business context, but part of the goal with Work Life and why I open source my fundraising deck or why I publicly talk about my LPs is I actually want to, create a paper trail of this is how you do it. Like, I think that if there's anyone who wants to start a fund, like, I'm a great example of, like, someone who's learned along the way, who should absolutely feel, the ability to go out and raise outside money and start their fund. If I can do it, you can do it. And I feel like in the same way that I want to be as open and authentic with the fund, I think it's also great to see that there are a lot of efforts and safe spaces for people to talk more freely about what's happening in the ecosystem. So I was really impressed. Kadrin, the CEO of Alpha, she was previously an engineer at YC. She decided to create a female founders network, which then became, one of the leading platforms for women to have these discussions. And you can have them either under your name or under no name. And you really start to hear and dig up some stuff. And the stuff that people say, you just need one person to come forward, and then many will fast follow. Yeah. And so I think in having these safe spaces on the internet, there are a lot of changes that are happening. I think in a lot of ways it has been that bottom up married with great places to work. So I kind of put pressure on both. And, like, if you're in a situation and you feel uncomfortable, there are safe spaces to actually talk about it, tell people, right. Because until you tell someone, we're not going to know about the other situations. And then from a top down point of view, there are great efforts and amazing male champions in Silicon Valley who are building very diverse and inclusive workspaces. I'm an angel investor in Webflow, and I couldn't think of a more inclusive place to work. Vlad is very much someone who publicly on Twitter talks about D&I efforts, who talks about male fragility. Like, he just has these real meaty conversations with people. Yeah. Because at the end of the day, especially in a space such as, low code and no code, it should be the most inclusive place because we're removing code as a barrier. We want to make it a great place to work. It's a great place for designers, for engineers to feel like they're building and, educating the next generation of people who are less technical. And then I also think that, moving beyond sort of Webflow and more of the tech part of the ecosystem, I also see, Henry from Carta has done a great job of partnering with #Angels and publishing the Gap table. Like, I think from a top-down point of view, we're thinking about equity and we're thinking about meaningful equity for women and people of color very early in the company's history. We're also, over time, course correcting or highlighting or bubbling up some of the issues that are systemic issues that it'll take some time to fix.
Right. What do you think of your being it was something you tweeted recently, and you tweeted something about being at conferences, and then did you read the Tim Ferriss thing about, like, being famous?
Yes.
That he just wrote?
Yeah.
Where he's very appreciative of his success and all that, but he's like, man, being famous has these kind of scary things that come with it.
For sure.
Like, people think they're in a relationship with you. Like, I get a tiny bit of that, like, not stalkers on the podcast, but people just come up to me and start talking to me about something. What are you talking about? And I realized, like, they thought they were in the conversation on the podcast. When you go to conferences, you get, like, harassed or craziness goes on around.
I've had some situations. I think going back to your point on people feel like they know you, I think we're entering this world which The pros of people being very open on the internet is that you do create safe spaces for conversations. You do actually create this dialogue where I think it's especially important for people who work from home, where it's like, oh, we're actually entering this period where you may actually go a week without seeing someone because you consistently work from home and like it's just you and your dog. Like that actually has real impact on your mental health. So I think that having these safe spaces online are great. I also think the cons to it can be these sort of parasocial relationships, which initially, like the definition of parasocial relationships actually came from housewives watching TV. So there's actually this whole notion where, you know, women who are spending a lot of time at home and primarily watching soap operas, you'd actually connect with the character so much that you felt like you knew them. And so one of the interesting things that, you know, I have joked around with friends and some people are talking about now is like, oh, if you only work from home and you know, ride your Peloton bike every morning and it's the same instructor every day and she's like shouting out and like, you know, it really feels like a social interaction. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, it's not a real social interaction. So I think that we do have to be mindful, and I think especially women in tech, I see this a lot with friends and folks in esports and in gaming, where I think one of the interesting things is like if you have individuals that are watching your Twitch stream for 4 hours per day or however many hours per week, then it does create a weird dynamic when you meet people in person. And I have experienced some situations that are a little bit uncomfortable. Some other, you know, women in tech who speak at conferences have also experienced some interesting situations. But I think for the most part, venues are getting better at that. I would say that protecting yourself on social media, I think that we need to be a little bit more mindful. So I typically try to check in later. You know, I'll post pictures when I'm traveling, but I'm not going to post like the exact location of where I'm staying. I also am pretty mindful where I think that if it's someone outside of my network, like I would love to respond to everyone on Twitter DMs and I would love to be, you know, as open and helpful as possible. But I also do keep a bit of a barrier, just knowing that, you know, there's a fine line between being helpful and being too friendly. Yeah. And you also don't want to open up too many interesting things that could happen in person.
Yeah. You realize that's kind of shocking to hear. Like most people don't think, like when I go to a conference, people come up to me, but I'm never worried. I'm never like wondering where the security guy is.
Sure. It's worrying. I think that there are a lot of really smart people solving it. So I know Tracy Chow is working on something in this space. Lee Honeywell is a fantastic YC founder. She's also working on something in this space. So I think we'll get to the point where people are a little bit more mindful of security and security online, whether it's like I use a YubiKey because I think it's important to protect, you know, my files and financial information and assets. I think the same will happen with maybe personal identity as well, where I think that, you know, I've been very fortunate. I've never had anything bad happen. I feel like a lot of the venues and scenarios where these things have occurred, it has been very large scale events, and there is usually security on staff. And to be honest, like oftentimes someone gets removed and thrown out of the venue before you even know they were there, which is both a blessing and a curse. I think it's a little bit scary because you're like, wait, I like don't know what this person looks like, or I don't know what happened. Right. But I think that venues are getting much better with security as well.
Wow. Well, this has been fascinating. What are you excited about next for your fund? Like what happens next? What animates you about it? It's congratulations, by the way. I know how hard it is to build a fund. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's been great. I mean, I think in the transition from angel to having a firm, the single-handedly the best metric has been the number of product designers, engineers, like people who are 1 or 2 or 3 years out of school emailing portfolio companies and saying they'd like to join because they've heard of WorkLife. And I think that's where, like, that's the data point for me, where it's like, if I can continue to invest in this brand, if I can continue to recruit as many great product builders and cool designers and like continue to sing the praises of WorkLife's, you know, brand and workplace software, then I think we'll end up landing with some really amazing companies. I think that overall, like, the workplace is changing. So I'm very much like in terms of investor problem fit, like you would not find someone that's more interested in making work better for everyone. And so I think part of that mission is just to continue to think about both how we educate portfolio companies, but then educate people who are thinking about starting companies. So I actually recently hired an engineer.
Congratulations.
So we're starting to look a little bit more like a tech company. Yeah, so she was very early engineer at Visco, also a fantastic engineer at GitHub. So she has that perfect balance of being both creative and thinking through more of like the creator economy from the Visco standpoint. She also has this amazing background where she's produced some amazing annual reports and a lot of original research and studies for GitHub, which is both a fully distributed team, also incredibly technical, and also like this core technology standard for engineers everywhere. So I'm super excited to have her on board, and I think we'll continue to think about both how do we build a platform to which founders can easily find information and access really relevant talks and content, and then more broadly, like how do we think about supporting people beyond the Bay Area, and how do we do things at scale?
Well, great. Thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, this is awesome. Thanks for having me.
All right. My guest has been Brianne Kimmel. This is the Something Venture podcast. I'll talk to you next time.